It is Monday. Welcome back to a new week. If you are experiencing disorientation, if you're not sleeping terribly well, if it's hard for you to concentrate, if you find yourself and your mind wandering, well, you may be experiencing exactly what I'm experiencing, and it's called Stockholm Syndrome. Stockholm Syndrome. That's a very light and maybe facetious way of explaining something or describing something that is actually not at all light. Many of us have the privilege of continuing to be home and to be stuck home. That is not the case with regard to millions of essential workers, approximately 30% of the entire workforce. So far, almost 55,000 Americans have died of the pandemic. A new study coming out from Yale, epidemiologists, they've been looking at actually the increase in deaths over the normal increase in deaths over the last 5 weeks. And they found that the pandemic and the deaths that are attributed to the pandemic, to coronavirus, COVID-19, those deaths are actually way understated in terms of the COVID-19 deaths. Relative to what the normal is in terms of deaths, what the Yale study is showing is that rather than 55,000 dead so far, it's more likely that we have 75 to 100,000 Americans have died and would not have died but for the coronavirus. In terms of unemployment, well, we're heading very rapidly toward a record level, at least since the Second World War, of 20% unemployment. I'm sorry to give you these statistics first thing Monday. They are downers and bummers, but it's important that we understand the reality of what we are in. That unemployment rate is not heading downward. It is likely to head upward for reasons that I will describe later on. I want to just go on for a little bit talking about Donald Trump's quackery and what that means for all of us, what's going on now this week, and then I will get to your questions. First of all, we have a bunch of states, about a dozen states, that are planning to reopen their economies. That's what they say. They call it reopening their economies. Well, they're not going to reopen their economies. All they're doing is that they're ceasing their orders to shelter in place. On the basis of all of the data I have seen, economic and the public health data, I think this is a terrible mistake because we can actually be inviting a new surge in cases and potentially deaths, requiring us to shelter in place once more. And that, in turn, would prolong the economic crisis. Nevertheless, states are doing it. And I think one reason they're doing it is because a lot of people are unemployed. They are down to their last dollar. They're not getting any money. The federal government money is not coming through for them. The unemployment insurance is not coming through. And so a lot of people are saying, I have got to get back to work. Well, here's the reality. The reality is that even though states are saying they are reopening their economies are actually not going to return to normal anytime soon. They are not reopening. And just think about your own self in terms of your own motives. You are not going to go back into crowded airplanes or crowded restaurants or crowded malls because you understand that there is a lot of danger lurking there. You are rational. Also, perhaps if you're like most Americans, you don't have a huge amount of discretionary income right now. You've gone through whatever discretionary income you've had. You're not going to go back and spending a lot of money. And the federal government's failure not only to warn us adequately and in time about this pandemic, but also to provide people with the money they need to tide them over means that the economy cannot get going because most people don't have money in their pocket to spend. This is economics 101, and I apologize if you already understand this, but it's very important that you do understand it. And that is that even before the pandemic, the bottom half of the American by wages, the bottom half of the American economy, where people were not doing well. Wages were still stuck in the mud. And most of the income gains were going to the very top. Most of the wealth gains were going to the very top. But if you are very wealthy, if you have a very high income, you're not going to spend nearly the same proportion of your income as you would if you were of more modest means. And that means, in turn, that the people who make up the great majority of America right now, the consumers of America, don't have the discretionary income to get the economy going again. And this is a huge problem, and it's not going to be solved anytime soon because the economy can't be turned on and off like a switch. There can't be a giant switch. So even though a lot of governors, maybe a dozen governors are saying, okay, the economy's reopened, it's not going to be reopened because of a combination of people's rational fears about going into crowded places, but also because they don't have the money to buy discretionary items, things that they don't otherwise need. Now, today, just for example, the second round of the payroll protection plan is going into effect. That is about $349 billion was already spent. $320 billion starts to be spent today. This is the federal program designed to keep people on payrolls, to help small businesses. Well, the information we're getting now about this program is that the first $349 billion went overwhelmingly not to small businesses, not to mom and pop businesses, not to Main Street, but it went to very big businesses. In fact, it went to businesses that were major clients of the big banks that actually just passed the money through. And this new $320 billion starting today that Congress enacted last week, well, it has the same flaws. The program was not improved. The rules are exactly the same. That means that big banks can favor their major customers. And those major customers are going to be big, and they are going to be well-positioned and have a lot of connections, and probably the least deserving and the least needy of that small business amount of money. Meanwhile, you individually, that $1,200, if you were already lucky enough to get it, well, great, but a lot of Americans haven't. Approximately 25% of Americans who would be eligible for that $1,200 one-time payment, they did not get it. They still haven't got it. And my information with regard to state unemployment offices, remember that $600 extra unemployment insurance you were supposed to get? Well, those offices are still overwhelmed with claimants, and the $600 is not going out, which just underscores the fact that this economy is not coming back anytime soon, because even in terms of the federal programs that were designed to help you get through this crisis, they're not doing it. Now, why, you might ask, are so many big corporations and the wealthy doing so well? By the way, there's $174 billion of tax breaks that were buried in that big coronavirus bill of about 2.5 weeks ago. That almost entirely went to big corporations and the wealthy. In other words, if you're talking about where the money is going, the federal money is going overwhelmingly to big companies, big corporations, the wealthy, the well-connected. And so obviously, the economy is not going to get going again because the big corporations, the well-connected, the big wealthy individuals who are getting these tax breaks, they are not going to spend very much of what they get. It is the bottom 50, 60, 70% that would spend, but they're not getting any money. Hello? There's also this issue of unfairness. Why is it that the big banks, the big corporations, the big and wealthy individuals are doing so well with regard to these government programs? It's a very simple answer, folks. It's because they have the lobbyists, they have the money, they have their hands into the till already. There's no countervailing power in Washington. Yes, the Democrats tried to do better than the Republicans, but if you want to know the truth, both parties have their corporate Wall Street wings, and those corporate Wall Street wings of both parties are very powerful, more powerful in the Republican Party, but they are also powerful in the Democratic Party. That is the system we have, this system. There is another factor, obviously, and that second factor is Donald Trump and the Trump administration. You take the two of them together, that is the system of major players, big money in politics that was there even before the Trump administration. And you have the Trump administration and Donald Trump and his people, and the combination is devastating in terms of responding to this coronavirus and getting the money where it is needed. Donald Trump, over the weekend, all he did was have a tweet storm. That tweet storm was his usual vindictiveness, anger, self-congratulation, grievance. I hope you didn't waste your time on those tweets. I do a little bit because I feel like I've got to convey something to you of the flavor of those tweets, but they were not the tweets of somebody who is most concerned about other people, about 55,000 Americans dying, about hundreds of thousands of people being gravely ill. No, the tweets were about him, our narcissist in chief. The tweets are about all the ways in which the fake news and the Democrats and everybody are piling on him because he suggested that disinfectant and bleach and ultraviolet light might be good for this coronavirus. And then he said, no, he didn't really say that. Oh, yes, he did say it. And now he's canceling his news briefings. He canceled today's news briefing. You see, the overall problem is at a time when we have this dread COVID-19, we desperately need leadership of a sort that some governors are providing, but we need leadership at the federal level, of the government, as a whole. We need leadership of the entire United States. We have a petulant, angry child, thin-skinned, vindictive, and narcissistic. And he has appointed a lot of people who don't really have many qualifications. Now, the HHS, Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar, over the weekend, there were rumors that the Trump administration wanted to get rid of him. Why? Maybe because he's incompetent. Maybe because the person he put in charge of the entire pandemic task force at Health and Human Services, which is the major department involved, had no background at all in any of this. He used to be a breeder of lab doodles. And also the person who was in charge of the research and development for developing a vaccine in HHS, a fellow named Rick Bright. You might remember last week what happened to him. Well, he was moved out of that job because he was not sufficiently supportive of hydroxychloroquine, which Trump thinks might be helpful. Without any scientific basis, another quack cure. This is all quackery, folks. And the problem, it would be one thing if we had just a narcissistic teenager in charge of the United States, but we have a narcissistic teenager who is making claims that are dangerous. People are responding to the claims. We know over the weekend there was a huge surge in people who tried to inject themselves with disinfectant or bleach. People pay attention. There is a bully pulpit. And if it's misused and abused, then people are going to be hurt. They are going to be seriously hurt and damaged. The same thing with what Trump has been saying about he doesn't want voting by mail. He doesn't want voting by mail because there's a lot of fraud. Well, there isn't fraud. And if you don't allow voting by mail, what's going to happen? You remember what happened in Wisconsin on April 9th? Well, it's going to happen all over the country on November 3rd in the general election if we don't have broad-based voting by mail, because a lot of people, even by November, are likely to be a little bit reluctant to turn up at the polls if there are crowds, if there are a lot of people voting. Is that a problem? Yes. Is it a problem for Republicans? Probably not, because Republicans, remember, don't like a lot of people voting, but Democrats do. Democrats win with a lot of people voting. And so that quackery about voting fraud, that is another piece of quackery that's going to harm a lot of people from Donald Trump. Mitch McConnell saying he's not going to bail out states. He's not going to bail out the states. State governments, by the way, state governments and local governments are running out of money. They are running out of money because they don't have the ability in their own laws or state constitutions to go deeply into debt. And they are facing huge expenditures, and their tax revenues are dropping. They're dropping because a lot of states depend on sales taxes, and a lot of states depend on income taxes, and sales taxes and income taxes are both dropping. So state revenues are dropping. Duh, Mitch McConnell. And the states are right there, first responders with regard to the coronavirus in terms of health, in terms of public health, in terms of testing, in terms of everything else we want the states to do. Donald Trump says, I'm not responsible, the states are responsible. All right, if the states are responsible and the states are running out of money, then the states actually do need a helping hand from the federal government. And yet, Mitch McConnell and the Republicans don't want to give the states any kind of a helping hand. He says the states should try bankruptcy. Well, where was Mitch McConnell when the last big coronavirus bill went into effect? And in that bill, remember, there was a huge provision, in fact, there still is, a huge provision of providing bankruptcy, not bankruptcy protection, but actually bailout for big companies. And so Mitch McConnell doesn't want to bail out the states. He wants to bail out big companies. That's the Republican position. Don't bail out the states. Don't bail out the locales that are on the front line in this pandemic. Bail out the big companies. Well, I'm sorry. Those priorities are wrong. That's another form of quackery. It's based on the notion of trickle-down economics, which is the biggest quack economics idea ever developed. It rewards the rich, starves everybody else, nothing trickles down. Now, let me just, before I get to your questions, one final word about reopening the economy. The economy is not going to reopen if people are scared to go into crowded places. It's not going to reopen if people cannot and will not buy very much. So we got to not only deal with the necessities of getting people tested and tracing where the virus is and isolating people who have them, but also we've got to get people the money they need, not only for themselves to survive, but also for the economy to begin to have a chance of bouncing back. Okay, your questions. Mike Bell. Please talk about the big banks and the fees they receive for giving SBA loans to their cronies who didn't deserve loans ahead of true small businesses. Mike, the banks, the big banks, under that last payroll protection plan that went through, that was the $349 billion a couple of weeks ago, the banks took away $10 billion of that $349 billion. Big banks, a lot of the big banks. Not only did they give their major customers an advantage, but they took a lot of money. $10 billion is not chump change. And the irony here is they didn't bear any risk because the SBA and the Treasury were underwriting and guaranteeing all of those loans. There was zero risk. The banks had to do nothing. Even with this new piece, this new $320 billion starting today, the banks do nothing, but they are still taking their fat fees. Why is that? Well, because the banks are well connected, frankly, politically. The banks and Wall Street know how to make a lot of money. Deborah Corbett Vutselas. I think I pronounced it correctly. As far as COVID-19 or anything relative to the subject, does anyone know what's going on with migrant families on the border? And you want statistics. Well, ICE's detention center on the border, Deborah, right now is holding 32,000 people. 32,000 migrants are being held in detention centers. Those are hotspots for the coronavirus because people are being, well, any place, our prisons, any place people are close together in close quarters, those are becoming hotspots for this virus. And so it's not being covered well by the media. The media are not allowed to go there, but 32,000 people at least are there. Also, another story right on the border is that all of those places that Trump is building the wall, those are construction camps. Those construction camps are also hotspots for the coronavirus for the same reason. People are very close together, very close quarters. And Blake McManus, since USPS has said repeatedly the package service is what keeps it afloat, why are we even discussing raising those fees? Since we all know consumers, not big business, bears the burden. And another closely related question from Pauline Morris. Please comment on the demise of the post office, especially in light of the fact that online and mail-in voting is going to be essential. Well, for both of you, USPS, the United States Postal Service, is going to be running out of money in September. Election Day is November 3rd. Put those two together. There is a close connection between, because the Republicans don't want mail-in ballots, and they wouldn't mind if the Postal Service either closed or yanked up its fees so high that a lot of people would be deterred from voting. And by the way, if the USPS, the United States Postal Service, closes, who is going to suffer the brunt of that? It's going to be Trump voters, because the USPS, the United States Postal Service, actually provides a subsidy to rural America. It's costlier to deliver mail in a lot of our rural areas, and that subsidy is paid for by everybody who lives in urban areas in terms of paying a little bit more. And if you end that cross subsidy, because everybody's going to have to pay more, or you say the entire Postal Service is going to go down the toilet, Trump voters are going to be hurt the most. They're going to lose their post offices. Jane Horn, when should we expect the $600 from the big CARES program? Was that $600 a week, and can I get it? I can't find it. I've been filing my fourth claim tomorrow. Will it be retroactive? Well, Jane, 44 states started last week providing, at least in theory, that $600 a week. It's going to continue until the end of July. And if I can just make sure I have the information correct, that program is going to continue on for 8 weeks. And you should be able to collect it retroactively. In fact, you will be able to collect retroactively from when? From the time when you originally filed your claim. So as long as you filed your claim, you can get it retroactively, and you are entitled to 8 weeks. The biggest problem, and I'm trying to look this up, the biggest problem is, again, the entire system is overly crowded. That is, it's not working. Other questions? Another question from somebody here, from David Jenkins. I hope I pronounced Jenkinsy. Your question is, Donald Trump, does he have a chance of winning re-election? Yes, he does have a chance of winning re-election. Now look, don't pay attention to the polls. The polls are showing that Donald Trump, his favorabilities are dropping. Well, those favorabilities are dropping. They have been dropping for the last week, which is one reason he went on a tweet storm, and why he is ranting and raving, and why he doesn't want to have another another briefing tonight, and he looks at his ratings going down. That's all he does: watch television, look at his ratings. But the polling is irrelevant, because the real issue is how many people get out to the polls, who's going to actually vote. And that depends on, obviously, who's motivated to vote. And this gets us back to several of your questions. You want to talk about Joe Biden. Joe Biden is there. He's trying to break through. He's having a hard time, because how do you break through if you have sheltering at home? He has to shelter at home. And the news business really does live off of conflict. That's what sells newspapers, sells ads, it sells eyeballs, conflict. So if Joe Biden is in his basement trying to talk realistically about what's going on in terms of the coronavirus and what's needed and public policy, and Donald Trump is indulging in every conflict imaginable with the WHO. He's putting up, rude anti-Biden tweets. He's retweeting them, or whatever he's doing. He stokes and loves conflict, and the media also love conflict because it sells papers and eyeballs and ads. And that means that there is a chance here that, just like we saw in 2016, when Hillary Clinton hardly got a small percentage of the coverage that Donald Trump got, that Joe Biden is not going to get very much coverage. And as we get up toward Election Day and Donald Trump starts attacking everybody and starts making news just through his attack dog approach, that you're going to see Joe Biden sort of overwhelmed, and the Democrats overwhelmed, because they won't be seen. There won't be enough news. The one good possibility, the one silver lining on this, all of this, is the very strong possibility that people just get turned off, as they got turned off the last couple of weeks. Donald Trump's ranting and raving and self-indulgence and self-congratulation and his boasting and his demeaning comments about everybody else and the press. And by the way, this weekend, he went after Fox News and the Wall Street Journal, not just CNN and MSNBC. But all of that becomes almost too much, even for his followers. They just say to themselves, this is so unprecedented. We need leadership. This is not leadership. And that could help. In fact, it will help. And let me end just on that note about leadership, because if there was ever a time in America when we needed leadership, we needed people at the top, not just the president, but people around him who knew what they were doing, who could say with some, and gaining some trust in the process, what was really going on, who were believable, who were credible, who were not just filled with their own narcissistic craziness. It is now. And I think what's really happened in America over the last month and a half, and maybe the disinfectant, bleach, ultraviolet light stuff marks a turning point in this. People begin to say to themselves, not just the majority, but even some Trump followers, they begin to say, we do have to have leadership. We've got to have a government that works for all of us. There is such a thing as the common good, and we are seeing it, and we are living the absence of leadership every single day. And therefore, on the silver lining, November 3rd turns out to be not just a victory for Joe Biden, but it also means that the Democrats take back the Senate and take back the House. And Mitch McConnell and his leadership is added to the dustbin of history. Thanks for tuning in. Oh, by the way, tomorrow, 11 o'clock Pacific and 2 o'clock Eastern, and all times in between, I'm going to be talking to Stacey Abrams, representative from Georgia, almost won the Georgia gubernatorial race. She has a lot of ideas about what should be done. She also wants to be vice president to Joe Biden, and she'll be talking about that. I'll be talking about with her tomorrow. That's 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern, all times in between. And we'll see you soon. Bye.